The call came in just after 3 p.m. on May 13th, 2012. It wasn't dramatic, just a worried family member reporting that a young woman hadn't come to pick up her children. But in investigations like this, the quiet starts often mask the ugliest truths. Estrella Carrera, 26 years old, was last seen 2 days earlier, the day she had gotten married. Now she wasn't answering her phone. Her car was in the lot. The door to her Burbank, Illinois apartment was locked from the outside. Her 2 children were waiting, but she never came. When officers from the Burbank Police Department forced entry, what they found turned a routine welfare check into a homicide scene. Estrella was lying face down in the bathtub, still wearing the silver sequined cocktail dress she had donned for her wedding celebration. The water was off. Her body was cold. There was no immediate sign of forced entry or a struggle in the living room or bedroom. The scene was eerily clean, too clean. She had married Arnoldo Jimenez just 48 hours prior. There was no honeymoon. There were no new family photos or social media updates. In fact, Arnoldo himself was nowhere to be found. His phone went dead shortly after their wedding night. His vehicle, a black Maserati, was missing. And there was one more detail. When Estrella's family called police, they didn't just say she was missing. They said they were afraid something terrible had happened. This case would eventually span 2 countries, a decade-long manhunt, and one of the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives. But on that Sunday afternoon in 2012, it was just a dead woman in a wedding dress and a silence no one could explain. The apartment was secured immediately. Crime scene technicians processed every surface, starting with the bathtub. The autopsy would later confirm that Estrella had been stabbed multiple times in the neck and torso. The wounds were deep and deliberate. There were no defensive wounds, which suggested she hadn't seen it coming or had no time to react. Blood patterns indicated she had likely been moved post-mortem. Lividity, rigor, and body temperature placed the estimated time of death at somewhere between 4:30 and 6 a.m. on May 12th, the morning after her wedding. Estrella's purse was found on the couch. Inside were house keys, an ID, and a folded piece of paper with a handwritten list of contacts. There was no sign of her cell phone. Her closet was untouched. The refrigerator was stocked. Whatever happened, it had happened suddenly and inside the window of just a few hours. One detail that stood out: the dress. It was not a formal wedding gown, but a shimmering silver cocktail dress, tight-fitting and clearly meant for a party. According to her cousin, Estrella had worn it to a nightclub in Chicago with her new husband and a few friends after the civil ceremony. They left the club around 4:01 a.m. No one had seen her alive after that. Arnoldo's phone went dark an hour later. Detectives flagged the missing Maserati. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex failed to show the couple returning, but a neighbor remembered hearing a car with a loud engine around dawn. The building didn't have security cameras on the rear lot. Investigators checked surrounding intersections for traffic cams but came up short. Estrella's building didn't offer much. No witnesses, no doorman, no pass card system. At the time of her death, Estrella worked for the Cook County Clerk's office and lived independently with her 2 children. Her daughter was from a prior relationship. Her son was fathered by Arnoldo. Police questioned friends, co-workers, and relatives. No one knew of any plans for an extended honeymoon. No one had heard of any conflicts. Yet several noted Estrella had hesitated about marrying Arnoldo at all. That comment struck investigators. One friend said Estrella told her the wedding was just paperwork. Another said she had a bad feeling about the relationship. But there were no formal complaints, no restraining orders, no prior domestic reports involving Arnoldo. That didn't mean nothing had happened. It just meant nothing had been reported. Detectives contacted the Department of Homeland Security and began working with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Within 48 hours of the discovery of Estrella's body, Arnoldo Jimenez was listed in NCIC as a person of interest. His last known location was tracked via his cell phone, which had pinged several towers on the route from Chicago through southern Illinois, into Memphis, and further south toward the Texas-Mexico border. The signal died near Laredo. The trajectory was too direct. There were no stops long enough to suggest he had taken time to hide. He wasn't in panic mode. He was in escape mode. Meanwhile, forensic processing of the apartment continued. There were no fingerprints on the faucet or the edge of the tub. No blood droplets were found outside the bathroom. But trace luminol sweeps did reveal faint footprints near the hallway, indicating someone had walked out without cleaning thoroughly, but the blood transfer was minimal. The perpetrator had taken time, possibly changed clothes, maybe wiped themselves down. No towels or garments were missing. In the eyes of investigators, this was not a spontaneous act. It was a sudden eruption of violence followed by methodical steps to contain it. What disturbed them most was the fact that the body was left in the tub, covered, silent, and still in her dress, as if Estrella had been turned into a monument to a night that should have been a beginning, not an ending. At the conclusion of the first 72 hours, Estrella's cause of death was officially ruled a homicide by sharp force injuries. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office documented 18 stab wounds, most of them clustered near vital areas. The wounds were described as rage-based. Her hands showed no signs of struggle. Her nails were intact. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol or narcotics. She had not been sedated. Whoever killed her did so up close, without hesitation. And by then, whoever did it was long gone. By the second day of the investigation, the timeline was narrowing, with the autopsy results placing the estimated time of death between 4:30 and 6 a.m. on May 12th. Detectives turned their attention to the hours preceding that window. The event in question was a civil wedding, followed by a nightclub outing with friends. What had started as a legal union was now a forensic clock, and everything between City Hall and the coroner's table became relevant. Estrella Carrera, born and raised in Chicago, had no prior criminal history. She was employed by the Cook County Clerk's Office and was pursuing a graduate degree part-time. Financial records showed stable income, no large debt, and no recent financial activity indicating stress or coercion. Friends and colleagues described her as private but dependable, someone who showed up when needed and rarely disclosed her emotional life in detail. She lived with her 9-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son in a modest unit in Burbank, where she had moved less than a year earlier. Investigators needed to determine not only where Estrella had been that night, but who she was with and why. The marriage certificate listed the groom as Arnoldo Jimenez, 30, a resident of Joliet, Illinois. DMV records showed his registration for a 2006 black Maserati Quattroporte. The vehicle was not listed as stolen, and no recent infractions had been logged. His last known address was a property shared with his brother. There was no record of recent employment, no tax filings for 2 years, and no driver's license renewal activity since 2010. Friends interviewed by police confirmed that the couple had a turbulent relationship. Multiple witnesses described periods of estrangement, including one in early 2011 where Estrella had told a close friend she was finished with the drama. Still, she never filed any restraining order or made any police report. There was no CPS involvement and no documentation suggesting domestic violence. What stood out in the interviews, however, was the language. More than one person used the phrase paper marriage. According to a cousin, Estrella had expressed doubts about the ceremony even on the morning of May 11th. She said it was for the sake of the kids, the cousin told police, like maybe it would calm things down. Another friend claimed Estrella called the wedding a formality, nothing more. A detail surfaced during a forensic search of her phone records. In the 24 hours before her death, Estrella exchanged text messages with a co-worker expressing unease. The texts were short and lacked specific allegations, but one line read, "I'm just trying to get through this day without fighting." The final outgoing message from her device was time-stamped 4:08 a.m. on May 12th. After that, all activity ceased. No one at the nightclub reported seeing anything unusual. Surveillance footage from the venue, later retrieved and processed, showed Estrella and Arnoldo entering together, smiling. They stayed for less than 2 hours, left without incident, and were seen walking to the lot where the Maserati was parked. No external cameras captured their exit route. No other patrons recalled any visible tension. Detectives also reviewed Estrella's bank activity. There were no large cash withdrawals, but an Uber transaction 2 days earlier showed a trip to a Joliet address, the same location registered to Arnoldo's vehicle. That detail confirmed she had spent the night with him in the days before the wedding. Her calls in that window were sparse, with no outreach to friends or family. In homicides involving domestic partners, the first layer of investigation focuses on known patterns. But this case lacked that. No history, no paper trail, just a silence that had gone unreported for too long. One detective noted in his report, "People think danger looks like a weapon. More often, it looks like someone who never made it into the system." The unit began constructing a behavioral profile. Arnoldo had no known psychiatric history, no military background. His social media accounts, now inactive, had shown no mention of the wedding. No photos, no acknowledgement. Estrella, in contrast, had posted only one image, a blurry shot of a champagne glass with no caption. There was one more discovery. At the apartment, in a folder beside Estrella's couch, detectives found a printed itinerary. It was for a family trip to Disney World, dated for the following month. The names listed included her children, not Arnoldo. That omission was not forensic, but it was telling. 6 days after Estrella Carrera was found dead in her apartment, the case took a pivotal turn. On May 19, 2012, detectives received a tip that led them to a private residence in Chicago, a suburban home registered under the name Humberto Jimenez. A search warrant was executed. In the garage, parked behind a closed door, was a black 2006 Maserati Quattroporte, partially covered by a tarp. It was the same vehicle listed on the marriage certificate as belonging to Arnoldo Jimenez. Crime scene technicians were called in immediately. The car had not been reported stolen. There were no obvious signs of tampering or body damage. The keys were inside the glove compartment. The gas tank was a quarter full, and the driver's seat was pushed far back. An observation noted due to Estrella's height at 5 feet tall. She would not have positioned it that way. The forensic team conducted a preliminary sweep. Traces of blood were detected in the front passenger side footwell using phenolphthalein testing. The results returned presumptive positive. Luminol confirmed additional staining beneath the floor mat, which had been recently cleaned. The surface appeared wiped but not thoroughly sanitized. A deep swab of the gear shift revealed a partial female DNA profile, later matched to Estrella's known sample. The passenger seat belt strap showed faint transfer patterns consistent with dried fluid. The fibers had a slight reddish discoloration. A closer examination revealed coagulated residue embedded into the belt stitching. There was no pooling of blood on the seat itself, which suggested that the victim may have been either partially supported or had already been incapacitated prior to being moved. Investigators also noted the absence of hair, tissue, or defensive damage inside the vehicle. There were no dents, broken mirrors, or cracked interior panels. No blunt impact evidence. This did not appear to be the result of a struggle in transit. The conclusion was methodical. Estrella had been wounded elsewhere, likely in the car, and transported to the apartment post-mortem. The vehicle's onboard diagnostics were pulled. The last ignition timestamp registered at 5:41 a.m. on May 12th, hours after the couple had left the nightclub. GPS tracking, while limited by the model year, showed a stop pattern matching the proximity of Estrella's apartment. The engine had remained off until it was restarted late that morning, then driven westward for over 3 hours before powering down again. That route aligned with tower pings recovered earlier in the investigation. On the passenger side door frame, a single latent fingerprint was lifted. It did not match Estrella's. The print was partial but usable. AFIS returned a preliminary hit. Arnoldo Jimenez, previously booked for misdemeanor assault in 2008 but never convicted. The match provided formal probable cause. His name, already present in internal case notes, was now entered into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC database, as a wanted person for questioning in a homicide investigation. What complicated matters was that Humberto, the brother, denied knowing how the vehicle got into his garage. He claimed he had been out of town, had no recent contact with Arnoldo, and stated he did not notice the car until officers arrived. His statement lacked credibility. Utility logs showed regular water and electricity usage in the home during the week following the murder. A neighbor recalled seeing someone resembling Arnoldo walking to the property 2 days earlier, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a grocery bag. Despite the inconsistency, Humberto was not charged. Prosecutors determined that insufficient evidence existed to tie him to obstruction, at least for the time being. But the discovery raised broader questions. If Arnoldo had help, who else was involved? And if he'd planned this escape, was it spontaneous or premeditated? The Maserati was impounded and transferred to the state crime lab for further processing. Carpet fibers were vacuumed, every vent was swabbed, and data from the vehicle's electronic control module was extracted. No weapons were found, no receipts, no burner phones, no obvious link to a second location. But the car had served its purpose. It was the bridge between a clean apartment and a missing man. Behind the wheel of that Maserati, a wedding had turned into a crime scene. In the quiet garage of a suburban house, police were now staring at the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. For the first time, investigators had a sequence: departure, disappearance, death, and now, transport. Back at the station, detectives updated the case board. The timeline was tighter. The digital evidence, vehicle telemetry, and blood spatter locations painted a cold and deliberate route. But one question still lingered. Why bring her back to the apartment? There were simpler places to leave a body, less risk, less trace, and yet she had been returned, intact, dressed, positioned in the bathtub of the home where her children would have found her if police hadn't arrived first. It wasn't just a disposal, it was a message. Investigators considered whether it signaled guilt, control, or possibly a symbolic reversal, taking back something one no longer had power over in life. Not every murder starts with motive. Some begin with fear, some with silence, and some, investigators knew, begin long before the first cut is made. The Maserati gave them movement. Now they needed direction. Following the vehicle's discovery and forensic sweep, the focus of the investigation shifted to mapping Arnoldo Jimenez's route after the suspected time of the murder. Detectives requested tower dump data from major cellular carriers spanning northern Illinois to southern Texas. Estrella's phone had gone dark around 4:08 a.m. on May 12th, but Arnoldo's phone, still active at the time, generated enough metadata to produce a usable trail. The device had pinged multiple towers along I-55 southbound in the early hours of May 12th. Between 5:41 a.m. and 7:58 a.m., location data placed the phone just outside Bloomington. There were no outgoing calls or messages during this stretch, but the movement was consistent with an individual driving uninterrupted. No deviation, no unexplained stop. By mid-morning, the signal continued through St. Louis, crossing into Missouri. Jimenez's phone connected briefly to a tower near Poplar Bluff, then jumped again near Memphis, Tennessee. The intervals suggested consistent movement at highway speed, with minimal breaks. Investigators noted that the phone remained active but silent. No apps, no navigation, no calls, just a presence. Detectives layered this with license plate recognition, LPR data. Although the Maserati's plates had not been flagged, an image surfaced from a traffic camera in Jackson, Tennessee. Time-stamped at 2:11 p.m. on May 12th, the grainy image showed a vehicle matching the Maserati's make and model, dark in color, with a distinct front bumper scratch consistent with DMV records. Though the plate wasn't readable, the shape and trim matched precisely. It was the only visual confirmation during the 1,000-mile run. The next ping came near Texarkana, Arkansas, close to 9 p.m. the same day. Jimenez's phone remained on the move until approximately 2:30 a.m. on May 13, when it connected briefly to a tower in Laredo, Texas, just north of the border with Mexico. After that, it shut off permanently. Whether the phone died, was destroyed, or swapped out could not be confirmed. But for law enforcement, the pattern was clear. They weren't looking for a panicked man fleeing blindly. They were tracking a calculated exit across multiple states in under 24 hours, moving through secondary highways to avoid major surveillance points. The stops were minimal: fuel, maybe food, no hotel bookings, no credit card use. He knew what he was doing. At this point, a federal warrant was issued. The FBI joined the case formally under jurisdiction for interstate flight to avoid prosecution. Jimenez's name and description were circulated through U.S. Marshals regional fugitive task forces. He was listed as armed and dangerous, although no weapon had been recovered. Agents interviewed his relatives in Joliet and Chicago. None claimed to have seen him, but one detail emerged. Jimenez had traveled to Mexico frequently over the previous decade. His parents were originally from Durango. His brother Humberto had a recent customs declaration listing Monterrey as a destination. The connection was circumstantial but relevant. U.S. Customs and Border Protection reviewed vehicle crossings logged at Laredo within a 12-hour window. No record of the Maserati appeared, but investigators believed Jimenez had likely crossed on foot or in another vehicle. He wasn't on any watch list at that time. His passport had not been flagged. He had no prior felony conviction that would have triggered additional scrutiny. This was a gap in the system, one that allowed mobility between countries if you knew how to avoid digital footprints. The next actionable lead came from toll booth surveillance. Video footage at the George Bush Turnpike in Texas showed a man fitting Jimenez's build in the passenger seat of a silver SUV. The vehicle was registered to a former co-worker, though she denied involvement. The footage quality was poor and facial recognition was inconclusive. Still, the time frame fit. That SUV had passed through Laredo within the correct window. With the digital trail going cold south of the border, the FBI issued an Interpol red notice. At this point, the case transitioned from homicide investigation to international fugitive tracking. But while investigators traced signals and tower hits, a more human question remained. Why didn't anyone stop him? A neighbor saw him days after the crime. A brother sheltered his car. Customs waved him through. No one acted. And behind those gaps were Estrella's two children, now living without answers. This case wasn't just about forensic gaps. It was about relational gaps. How silence between people can be more dangerous than silence in data. When someone's pattern of control goes unreported, the system stays blind until it's too late. Once the trail ended at Laredo, the case entered a different phase. One governed less by fresh leads and more by persistence. With Arnoldo Jimenez now listed under an Interpol red notice and the FBI's interstate warrant in place, the case became a quiet hunt. No courtroom, no new evidence. Just time and what it did to a murder investigation that had stalled at an international border. For the family of Estrella Carrera, silence had a cost. Her two children were relocated to the care of relatives. The youngest, a boy she had with Jimenez, would grow up under the shadow of that name. There was no estate, no insurance, no media foundation. The only thing that endured was a digital case file and a monthly follow-up by law enforcement. In 2013, the FBI transferred the file to its fugitive task force in Chicago, flagging it as a long-term fugitive target. Jimenez had no new credit history, no U.S. tax filings, and no confirmed crossings back into the country. But through mutual legal assistance treaties, Mexican authorities were periodically briefed. Every few months, agents would revisit the case, checking if new biometric data or records surfaced. There was nothing. No bank activity, no phone registrations, no formal sightings. But in 2014, Homeland Security received a tip, anonymous, vague, but potentially credible. A man matching Jimenez's description had been spotted in Monterrey, Mexico, working under an alias in a car repair shop. The tipster didn't know his name, only that he spoke fluent English and avoided any government interaction. Surveillance of the area began quietly, but yielded no proof. By the time agents tried to cross-reference names and documents, the man was gone. This would become a pattern. Hints surfaced, never full leads. A second sighting in 2015 came from a former acquaintance of Jimenez, who claimed he saw him at a wedding near San Luis Potosí. The account was unverified. No photos, no address. Just a vague description from memory, tied to the same haircut and voice. In 2016, the FBI reviewed the case for top 10 most wanted consideration. To qualify, a fugitive must not only pose a serious risk, but also be highly recognizable to the public. Estrella's murder met the first condition: violent, domestic, and premeditated. But Jimenez had no online footprint, no notoriety. He wasn't a serial killer or a cartel figure. He was, to most, forgettable. That changed in 2019. The Bureau elevated Jimenez to its 10 most wanted list. His name joined a list of armed robbers, child murderers, and international traffickers. A $100,000 reward was announced for information leading to his capture, later raised to $250,000. The image used on the wanted poster was his last known DMV photo, a neutral expression, short cropped hair, and nothing to suggest what he had done. Public response was limited. His name never became a headline. Unlike other fugitives, Jimenez had no active social media, no taunting emails, no messages to authorities. Just absence, and that made him harder to catch. Internally, law enforcement began working profiles. Analysts examined the psychology of fugitives who flee after domestic murders. Most don't last more than 2 years before surfacing, often through new relationships or criminal behavior. But Jimenez didn't resurface. No weapons charges, no drug ties, no assaults. The absence of criminal indicators suggested he may have assumed a private life. Low risk, off-grid, deliberately static. In 2020, agents started canvassing funeral records, tax filings, and border death registries, considering the possibility that he was deceased. No match came up. The only constant was that Monterey remained the likeliest location. Tips trickled in. One claimed he worked construction. Another said he lived with a new partner under a false identity. But none came with proof. The FBI kept the reward up. The posters stayed online. Jimenez remained a fugitive, but the case itself went cold in terms of movement. His file sat among hundreds, open but inactive. Still, someone always checks. And cases like this only need one mistake. By the end of 2024, more than 12 years had passed. But in cases involving domestic violence and murder, there's no statute of limitation, no expiration. The file never closes. One investigator summarized it this way: "These aren't just fugitives. They're reminders of what happens when silence wins." On January 30th, 2025, nearly 13 years after the murder of Estrella Carrera, Arnoldo Jimenez was arrested without incident in Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico. The arrest did not happen by chance. It was the product of a coordinated international effort involving the FBI, Interpol, and Mexico's Fiscalía General de la República, FGR. What began with a silent manhunt finally ended with a knock on a high-rise apartment door. In late 2024, a confidential tip reached the FBI's Chicago field office. The source was not publicized and remains undisclosed in official filings. But the information was detailed. Jimenez had been living under an assumed name in a residential building in central Monterrey. He was reportedly working informally in vehicle repair and had maintained a low profile by avoiding digital systems, banking in cash, and limiting public interaction. The lead was vetted, confirmed through cross-agency intelligence, and acted upon. Mexican authorities, under pressure from ongoing bilateral agreements on fugitive extradition, mobilized a tactical response unit. The operation was executed in the early morning. Entry was forced after a brief delay. Jimenez did not resist. He identified himself using a false name, but was fingerprinted on site. The match was immediate. His appearance had changed only slightly. He had grown facial hair, gained minor weight, and adopted a more casual posture in public. But biometric comparison confirmed his identity within hours. No weapons were found in the residence, no contraband, just routine personal items and a forged identification card bearing his alias. What stood out to authorities was the simplicity of his setup. One prepaid cell phone, no internet connection, no computer. One used car registered under a fake name with expired paperwork. His apartment lease had been paid in cash for over a year. The absence of traceable data wasn't accidental, it was maintained. U.S. officials filed for extradition under the terms of the 1978 extradition treaty between the United States and Mexico. Because Jimenez was charged with first-degree murder, a non-political violent offense, the criteria were met without significant legal friction. Within days, he was transferred into temporary holding, and the legal process began. His attorneys attempted to delay transfer on procedural grounds, but those efforts were rejected. The case file, once static, was updated. The booking photo from 2025 was uploaded to the FBI's public archive. The captured banner was added to his 10 most wanted profile. Internally, federal agents closed the fugitive status designation and reclassified the case as awaiting prosecution. From a tactical perspective, the arrest was clean. There were no press leaks, no resistance, no standoff. But the emotional closure for Carrera's family came with weight. Estrella's children, now teenagers, had lived over a decade with uncertainty. They weren't in court. They weren't notified in advance. But the arrest meant the man accused of killing their mother could no longer disappear. What made this case unique wasn't the violence. It was the gap, the span of time during which nothing happened, and then everything did. The investigation never lost formal momentum, but without movement, time had dulled public awareness. The only people who never forgot were the ones who lived with the absence. One of the agents involved in the original 2012 search warrant later noted, "We don't always get to finish the cases we start, but this one came back. There was no celebration, just resolution." Jimenez awaits extradition as of this writing. If convicted in the United States, he faces life in prison. Prosecutors are not seeking the death penalty. The case will proceed through the normal judicial process in Cook County, Illinois, where the original warrant was issued. This chapter closes a long pursuit, but not the story. Legal proceedings remain. Family healing is another process entirely. But accountability, delayed or not, changes the equation. After his arrest in Monterrey, Arnoldo Jimenez was processed for extradition under U.S.-Mexico agreements. The transition was administrative, not dramatic. No appeals were filed beyond initial formalities. He did not contest the extradition. On March 12, 2025, he arrived in Illinois under federal escort, booked into the Cook County Jail. For investigators, it was the final link in a chain that began with a wedding and ended with a fugitive in custody 13 years later. The formal charge remained unchanged: first-degree murder. Prosecutors from the Cook County State's Attorney's Office confirmed that no plea deal was being offered. The charge carried a sentence of 45 years to life, without the possibility of parole if convicted. The prosecution's case rested on physical evidence collected in 2012. Blood samples, cell site data, the Maserati, the timeline reconstruction, and motive inference through circumstantial context. There were no witnesses to the crime itself, but the chain of evidence didn't require one. The car alone placed Jimenez at the center of the timeline. The blood in the passenger footwell matched Estrella Carrera's DNA. The last ping of her phone aligned with the time frame when his car was logged through cell towers. His fingerprint on the doorframe. The fact that the Maserati was hidden in his brother's garage. The silence afterward. The disappearance. The flight. The years spent off-grid in another country under a false name. No single element proved guilt. But collectively, the data was linear. No contradictions, no alternative theory. Defense counsel moved to suppress the vehicle search, citing a lack of probable cause. The judge denied the motion. All search warrants had been executed within constitutional guidelines. A second motion aimed to block the admission of GPS data due to technological obsolescence. It was also denied. The court upheld the admissibility of tower dump data as standard procedure. What followed wasn't spectacle. There was no packed courtroom or live stream. Jury selection took place under standard protocol. The press covered the case, but public interest had dwindled over time. To most, it was an old file finally being closed. Testimony focused on forensics. Crime scene investigators testified on the condition of Estrella's body. She had sustained 18 stab wounds, most concentrated in the neck and upper torso. There were no defensive injuries, suggesting the attack was sudden. The bathtub placement, post-mortem, was consistent with stage concealment. The forensic pathologist reiterated the cause of death as sharp force trauma with major vascular injury. Death was near immediate. Detectives reconstructed the night, the wedding, the celebration, the final departure from the club at 4 a.m., and the lack of contact afterward. A neighbor recalled hearing a car early that morning. The garage camera, though not active, still confirmed no other vehicles had arrived during the window in question. A forensic analyst explained the trace blood evidence in the car, including a partial female profile on the seatbelt and under the dashboard carpeting. The same analyst mapped the cell tower sequence, Chicago to Laredo, corroborated by DHS and CBP logs. The defense strategy focused on reasonable doubt. They pointed to the absence of a murder weapon, no direct eyewitness, and no clear motive. But there was little left to contest. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. On April 18, 2025, the verdict was returned, guilty of first-degree murder. Jimenez showed no visible response. Sentencing followed 2 weeks later. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. No statement was given. For the public, there was no catharsis, just resolution. Carrera's family released a short message, thanking law enforcement for never closing the case. They did not attend the trial in full. For them, the result did not erase the absence. Justice was procedural. Grief was personal. This trial wasn't about discovering who did it. It was about confirming that no one else could have. After the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, the case of Estrella Carrera left the public eye. There were no extended interviews, no televised sentencing breakdowns. Arnoldo Jimenez was placed in a maximum security facility in Illinois, where he began serving life without parole. On paper, the system had worked. A violent offender had been identified, pursued, apprehended, and convicted. But justice, even when fulfilled procedurally, does not always restore what was taken. For Estrella's family, the sentence did not erase 13 years of absence. Her mother, once the primary caregiver for Estrella's children, declined most media requests. The children, now adolescents, had grown up with silence where answers should have been. They lived with a name tied to a man convicted of killing their mother, and with a past largely defined by what was missing. No victim impact statement was read aloud in court. No family member addressed the defendant directly. In private, they expressed gratitude that the process had ended. But no closure could reset the clock. From an investigative standpoint, the case became a model in forensic endurance. It demonstrated how digital evidence, even from 2012, could outlast the strategies of fugitives who relied on distance and time. Analysts reviewing the file noted how the initial forensic groundwork, the blood patterns in the car, the mobile data sequence, the pattern of concealment, allowed the case to stay viable through over a decade of investigative dead ends. What began as a local homicide evolved into an international manhunt because early steps were executed with discipline. Internally, the FBI highlighted the case as an example of persistence. Jimenez had no repeat offenses, no electronic trail, and no criminal reappearance. He simply vanished. But the system did not forget. His listing on the 10 most wanted was not just symbolic. It kept pressure active, attention high, and leverage open in international coordination. Still, there were systemic reflections. Jimenez crossed the U.S.-Mexico border without alert, despite being named as a person of interest within 72 hours of the murder. His escape underscored limitations in early interagency data integration and the difficulty of capturing individuals with no prior convictions or biometric registration. The case also reignited dialogue around the unseen patterns of domestic violence, those that never reached court filings, police reports, or hotline calls. Estrella had never reported abuse. There were no prior protective orders, no documented threats. But in the quiet recollections of those close to her, unease had been voiced, doubt had been expressed, and it had gone unanswered. One of the investigators noted in a post-trial debrief, there was no system failure, but there was human hesitation, and sometimes that's enough. No law can predict private escalation, but the justice system can listen better when small signals surface. Estrella's case now appears in training materials for domestic violence awareness in law enforcement settings, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in what warning signs might look like when they don't fit conventional templates. In the years since the conviction, there have been no appeals. Jimenez has remained in state custody without incident. The Maserati was destroyed in evidence disposal proceedings. The apartment where Estrella was found was re-rented within a year. Life procedurally moved forward. But for those who carry the memory of what happened in May 2012, time does not erase. It only records. This case did not end with a confession. It did not offer redemption or narrative symmetry. It ended with facts, with sequences, with a life taken, a flight, a trail, and a return. Justice was achieved not through drama, but through quiet, relentless function. And in that, perhaps, is the most human point of all. Justice took years, but silence didn't win. As someone who's followed every turn of this case, I can tell you, sometimes justice isn't loud. It's quiet, relentless, built on details, not drama. If this story teaches us anything, it's that the signs we ignore can become the outcomes we mourn. Pay attention. Speak up when something feels wrong. And don't underestimate the value of persistence, not just from law enforcement, but from everyday people who refuse to forget. If this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you most. And if it didn't speak to you, I'd still love to hear why. Your voice matters. If you want more real stories that hit home, subscribe now and follow for what's next.